of issues for later discussion. And now we'll welcome our second speaker, which is Yasuhisa Yamamoto.
Is there a PowerPoint?
Yes. Hello, good morning. Let me introduce myself a bit. My name is Yasuhisa Yamamoto, Economic Affairs Officer at the UN ESCOR. And one of my research interests rests on macroeconomics, which is a branch of economics that deal with the aggregated economic agents, such as aggregated consumer, aggregated producer, aggregated government. We often assume those aggregated and quite abstract economic agents could act as individual consumer, producer, and government. Some years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, I had a talk with an economist, fellow economist, specializing rural development and poverty issues. We discussed a particular country's economic situation. He talked much about the issue of governance, corruption, politics, lack of infrastructure, and suggested that the government there would need to increase development expenditure for their priority. Unfortunately, I countered his argument, saying that the country had a severe balance of payment problem with depleting foreign reserves. A large portion of the government revenues was financed by debt. A large amount of debt was held by the central bank, and asset side of central bank's balance sheet awash with domestic government debt, not foreign assets. This monetization of government deficit caused a hyperinflation. Then, from my point of view, what should be the priority of the government should be a set of macroeconomic policies, such as a devaluation of the national currency, a measure to discourage imports and encourage exports. In sum, any measures to restrict expansion of domestic demand. Upon my saying, he listened to me, and he told me that okay, but you sounded more like an accountant, not an economist. So that's, for my career, my turning point, say. Sorry. This event made me think and rethink about the way to see an economy for analytical investigations. I also realized that the way I look economic realities was framed by several accounting principles, and that when macroeconomists talk about data, they are not talking about observed data, but in many cases, what are estimated from accounting principles. I have been aware that the system of macroeconomic accounting, which is formally known as the System of National Accounts, SNA, has technical limitations. For a well-known example, labor within a household is not accounted as value added if it is not paid. The informal sector is less likely to be counted. An equal exchange of value rarely holds in economic transactions, which give rise to a fundamental question of money as a unit of measurement. Despite knowing these limitations, I have been holding my opinion that essential macroeconomic indicators, such as gross domestic product, GDP, national income of SNA are still the best proxies that reflect economic realities. Moreover, I have to point out that those indicators occupy the axiomatic status in economic discussions among experts and non-experts alike. In the meantime, I really feel compelled to be critical to macroeconomists, including myself. The controversy over the structural adjustment programs since the 80s are well documented for many countries, particularly for the rural sector of developing economies. Despite their questionable records, international financial institutions are now advocating a so-called poverty reduction strategy approach that was evolved out of the structural adjustment programs. At the core of these programs, those institutions use macro accounting-based models known as the Revised Minimum Standard Model, or RMSMX, or financial programming. While I'm not against the use of those macro accounting-based models, I believe it is time to rethink the way macroeconomists recognize economic realities. As part of my effort to be critical of my expertise, in this talk, I'd like to provide a short review as to how macroeconomists' way of thinking, such as double-entry bookkeeping and accounting, and growth metaphor derived from them, how those things was formed as a social construct. I would also like to point out that macroeconomists' analytical thinking is biased for urban, formal, and measurable sectors as they fit into their growth metaphor. The rural sector is often left out and missing in the economic reality that macroeconomists are seeing. We need to revise the accounting principle to modify the dominant growth metaphor to redress this bias. Historically, there are two streams of the developments for the creation of present-day macroeconomic accounting statistics. The first stream of developments includes the measurement of and quantitative reasoning that made available for an aggregated abstract economic entity or a macroeconomic entity, such as a community or a state. William Petty's political arithmetic in 17th century is usually referred as the origin of macroeconomic accounting. And Petty calculated the national income with other economic aggregates which was used to assess the strength of the material power of England, comparing to its commercial rivals, Holland and France. A century later, François Quesnay's tableau économique followed, which more focused on intersectoral relationships between agricultural sector and other production sectors in seeking investable and taxable surpluses for the state. The second stream includes double entry bookkeeping, and double entry bookkeeping was invented in the 15th century. Since then, the practice of double entry bookkeeping was made sophisticated and increasingly applied to businesses in the 19th century. In double entry bookkeeping, every transaction results in two equal and offsetting entries, one a debit and the other credit. The importance of double entry bookkeeping was addressed by famous social theorists such as Max Weber, Joseph Schumpeter, and Werner Zombert. They argue that accounting plays a key technical role in enhancing rationality and enhancing the development of capitalist methods of production. Double entry accounting makes it possible for capitalists to evaluate rationally the consequences of their past decisions. They can calculate exactly the resources currently available to them and those that will be forthcoming in the future. Even though Petty's table was based on double entry bookkeeping, the structure was once lost and then revived by Keynes in 1940. Keynes gave considerable attention to the question of balancing and applied a clear double entry accounting framework to his work in How to Pay for the War. The fundamental accounting principle for today's national account was quickly established after that. And nowadays, many people, experts and non-experts alike, take the indicator such as GDP of national accounts as taken for granted economic reality. Some people treat GDP figures as if they are directly observable. In fact, some member states of the United Nations sometimes complain that the estimated GDP figures by the United Nations are different from true figures. GDP gained the axiomatic status by now as if it is directly observable data. However, GDP is not directly observable. Macroeconomic data, when in the form of monetary aggregate, are not the value discovered, but created. One aspect of macroeconomics can be defined as an inquiry that follows a quantitative formalism on a socially constructed reality. And the reality depicted is created by history, a theory, particularly the accounting principle that was applied. When discussing the reasoning for economic growth, macroeconomists prefer using the word growth mechanism rather than growth metaphor. However, the metaphor would be a more appropriate term as there is no directly observable mechanism of economic growth. The presently dominant growth metaphor rests on the concept of accumulation. Double entry bookkeeping makes it possible to analyze the internal structure of accounting entity in the form of balance sheet for stock and the profit and loss account that deal with flow. Several important concepts had emerged from double entry bookkeeping practice, which are balance, surplus, deficit, and accumulation. As Zombart asserted in one of his books, the capital did not exist before double entry bookkeeping. The concept of accumulation was numerically made clear by double entry bookkeeping. As a summation of surpluses, the concept of accumulation is linked to a visual metaphor of stock and flow, which also appeals to intuitive sense. Moreover, the accumulation out of balance suit well in mainstream economics for their emphasis on equilibrium and steady state as a basis of their analysis. Accumulation constitutes the main growth metaphor in economic development, and in mainstream economic literature, the growth is driven by investments which lead to capital accumulation, either in the form of physical capital or even human capital. What the dominant growth metaphor values are the surpluses that can be accumulated. In order to accumulate, the surpluses need to be measurable, quantifiable, and addable. These conditions of the growth metaphor, in addition to the main assumption of the construction of national accounts, cause the urban bias of macroeconomic analysis in favor of urban and formal sectors. Those sectors are fit in well in the growth metaphor. The rural sector is left out, and here I would like to discuss the three sources of the bias. The number one, measurability. Most economic activities are assumed to be market-bound and be reflected by transaction of exchanges between goods, services, and money. From the record of transaction, we can measure the value of goods and services. However, if there is no economic transaction, goods and services provided will not be measured. Historically, business progressively take over the function of, say, some household labor, baking, sewing, canning, laundering, that sort of thing. And when the potential economic transactions were completed within the household, they will not provide measurable economic surpluses. Consequently, whereas economic transactions of urban and formal sector are well measured, those of rural and typically informal sector are not. The second source of bias, I would like to point out the unit of measurement. Unit of measurement is a common denominator for various goods and services so that we can add them up. The universal unit of measurement used in all accounting is a basis of exchange, which is often called the money of account. Unfortunately, however, this unit is far from ideal. Market prices do not reflect the relative economic significance of different categories of goods and services. Market prices do not reflect equal exchange of values. Market prices, which is the basis of price applied to in measuring goods and services, do not reassure the value. The price may be determined reflecting the social relationship between economic actors, while the prices of goods and services of urban sector are more likely to be determined in a monopolistic context where the prices stay above competitive prices. The rural sector, particularly agricultural sector, is exposed to competition, and the sector often a price taker. The terms of trade between urban and rural sector are naturally more beneficial to the urban sector. And third source, land as a main factor of production. A crucial factor of production in the rural sector, land, is also left out from the dominant growth metaphor of capital accumulation. Land is assumed not to be accumulated, while investments and an incremental increase in capital stock will have a return to investment. The land is assumed to be produce rents, which is more of the return on scarcity. However, land needs investment in various forms, including continuous cultivation, and the value of farming land can be either appreciated or depreciated. In an extreme case, land can be degraded and be useless for productive farming. A farmer needs to be applied production techniques which are suitable under the conditions they face, and determine their farming portfolio to maximize their productivity, avoiding replant failure and preserve the state of cultivation, etc. In this point, again, the rural sector is left out. So, in conclusion, can we redress the urban bias in macroeconomic account? As of today, I don't have the specific answer to this question. Of course, national account has been developed. Now they have satellite account, such as environmental account and water account. But in practice, it is not well linked. There's a concept, but in practice, I haven't seen any that the serious macroeconomic model or discussion based on the extended national account, including environment and water. But having said this, I really wanted to point out with my presentation is, yes, there are maybe many of you have experienced that the arrogant macroeconomists. But this, I just wanted to say that this is one reason why. Thank you very much. We specialize in rural development and poverty issues. We discussed a particular country's economic situation. He talked much about the issue of governance, corruption, politics, lack of infrastructure, and suggested that the government there would need to increase development expenditure for their priority. I countered unfortunately, I countered his argument, saying that the country had a severe balance of payment problem with depleting foreign reserves. A large portion of the government revenues was financed by debt. A large amount of debt.
Very much. A lot to look forward to in terms of issues for later discussion. And now we'll welcome our second speaker, which is Yasuhisa Yamamoto.
Is there a PowerPoint?
Yes. Hello, good morning. Let me introduce was held by the central bank, and asset side of central bank's balance sheet awash with domestic government debt, not foreign assets. This monetization of government deficit caused a hyperinflation. Then, from my point of view, what should be the priority of the government should be a set of macroeconomic policies, such as a devaluation of the national currency, a measure to discourage imports and increase exports. In sum, any measures to restrict expansion of domestic demand. Upon my saying, he listened to me, and he told me that okay, but you sounded like more like an accountant, not an economist. So that's, for my career, my turning point, say. Sorry. This event made me think and rethink about myself a bit. My name is Yasuhisa Yamamoto, Economic Affairs Officer at the UN ESCOR. And one of my research interests rests on macroeconomics, which is a branch of economics that deal with the aggregated economic agents, such as aggregated consumer, aggregated producer, aggregated government. We often assume those aggregated and quite abstract economic agents could act as individual consumer, producer, and government. Some years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, I had a talk with an economist, fellow economist,